Before we begin, please consider to like and subscribe. It will help a lot. Thank you. The galaxy learned to fear the sound of laughter, not the gentle chuckle of the Velthari merchants, nor the chittering mirth of the Corran hive minds. No, it was the low, bitter sound that came from the human's throat when he found something amusing in the endless void of space. It was the kind of laughter that made entire fleets change course, that turned diplomatic negotiations into surrender ceremonies, that reminded every species in the known galaxy why they had tried so desperately to kill every last member of his kind. His name was Thomas, though no one called him that anymore. The survivors had taken to calling him simply the Human, as if he were the only one who had ever existed, the Alpha and Omega of his entire race. In a way, they were right. The galactic Concordat had been thorough in their extermination. Every human world burned, every colony ship vaporized, every outpost, every research station, every remote mining facility. All of it reduced to ash and memory. They had hunted his people across 1,000 light years, driven by a fear that had grown from whispered rumors into systematic genocide. The humans were too dangerous, they said, too unpredictable, too willing to break the ancient rules that kept civilization from tearing itself apart. They had to be stopped before they could spread their chaos to the rest of the galaxy. For 3 years, the Concordat believed they had succeeded. Thomas floated in the command chair of his ship, if it could still be called that. The vessel had once been a standard human exploration craft, but decades of modifications had transformed it into something else entirely, part warship, part laboratory, part tomb for the memories of 7 billion souls. Its hull was scarred by countless battles, patched and repatched until the original design was barely recognizable. But it still flew. And more importantly, it still killed. The bridge around him was silent except for the steady hum of life support and the occasional beep from his sensor array. He had grown accustomed to the solitude, though it had nearly driven him mad in the early years. Now it was simply another aspect of his existence, like breathing or the steady ache in his chest that never quite went away. A soft chime indicated an incoming transmission. Thomas glanced at the display and felt that familiar twist of amusement curl his lips. The hegemony of Nala was requesting an audience. Again. He had been expecting this. For the past 6 months, Thomas had been methodically working his way through the Nala trade routes, disrupting their commerce with surgical precision. He never targeted civilian vessels. That wasn't his way. Instead, he focused on military convoys, government shipments, and the private fleets of the oligarchs who had voted for human extinction. Each attack was carefully planned, precisely executed, and absolutely devastating. The Nala military had tried to stop him, of course. They had sent patrol squadrons, then full battle groups, then entire fleets. The wreckage of their finest ships now drifted through a dozen star systems, silent monuments to their failure. Thomas had studied their tactics, learned their weaknesses, and turned their own strengths against them. He had become very good at killing, but he had also become something more. The transmission was from Admiral Kethvar, the Nala's supreme military commander and one of the chief architects of the human genocide. The alien's 4 eyes glowed with barely contained fury as his image filled the view screen. "Human," Kethvar began, his translator rendering the words in crisp, emotionless tones. "Your actions have become intolerable. The hegemony demands your immediate surrender." Thomas leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled before his face. "Hello, Admiral. It's been, 2 weeks since our last conversation. You've lost weight. Stress eating getting to you." The Nala's mandibles clicked in agitation. "You will cease these attacks immediately and submit yourself to Concordat justice, or we will be forced to take more drastic measures." "Drastic measures?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "More drastic than genocide? I'm impressed by your creativity, Admiral. Please, tell me what you have in mind." Kethvar's image flickered as he leaned closer to his own screen. "We know about the colony ship." Thomas went very still. For the first time in months, his expression showed something other than cold amusement. "What colony ship?" "The Aspiration. We have found records indicating that it escaped the purge, carrying over 40,000 human civilians to the outer rim. Our scouts are tracking it even now." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken threats. Thomas could feel something building in his chest, a pressure that threatened to crack his carefully maintained composure. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You're lying." "Am I?" Kethvar's smile revealed rows of sharp teeth. "The ship is currently in the Erebus Nebula, approximately 15 light-years from your position. They have been hiding there for 3 years, believing themselves safe. But our sensors are very sophisticated, human. They cannot hide forever." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of loss settle over him like a funeral shroud. He had searched for survivors for years, following every lead, investigating every rumor. There had been nothing. No signals, no signs, no trace of his people anywhere in the galaxy. He had accepted that he was alone, that the burden of remembrance fell to him alone. But if Kethvar was telling the truth, "What do you want?" he asked. "Surrender yourself to us, and they live. Continue your campaign of terror, and we will finish what we started. The choice is yours." Thomas opened his eyes and stared at the alien's image for a long moment. Then, slowly, he began to laugh. It was not the bitter sound the galaxy had learned to fear, but something deeper, richer, touched with a kind of terrible joy. "Admiral," he said, wiping tears from his eyes, "you have just made the worst mistake in the history of your species." The transmission cut out, leaving Thomas alone with the stars and his thoughts. He sat in silence for several minutes, processing what he had learned. Then he reached for the ship's navigation controls and began plotting a course for the Erebus Nebula. It was time to go home. The Aspiration was exactly where Kethvar had said it would be, hidden deep within the swirling gases and electromagnetic storms of the nebula. Thomas had almost missed it at first. The colony ship's emissions were barely distinguishable from the background radiation, but there it was. A massive vessel, nearly 2 kilometers long, drifting silently through the cosmic fog like a metal island in an endless sea. Thomas brought his ship alongside the Aspiration's docking bay and felt a strange sensation in his chest as the airlocks cycled. It had been so long since he had breathed air that other humans had breathed, so long since he had heard voices speaking in his native tongue. For a moment, he wondered if this was all an elaborate hallucination, a product of too many years alone in the dark. But then the inner door opened and he found himself face to face with Captain James Morrison, the Aspiration's commanding officer. Morrison was older than Thomas remembered, his hair gone grey and his face lined with the weight of 3 years in hiding. But his eyes were still sharp, still alert, and they widened in recognition as he saw who stood before him. "Thomas Harry," Morrison breathed. "My God, we thought you were dead." "I was," Thomas replied, "for a while." They embraced then, 2 survivors of a massacre that had consumed their entire species. Thomas could feel Morrison trembling against him, and he realized that the captain was crying. He held the older man until the shaking stopped, then pulled back to look him in the eyes. "How many?" Thomas asked. 43,412, Morrison said without hesitation. "We saved who we could when the attacks began. Children mostly, scientists, a few military personnel. We've been hiding here ever since, trying to figure out what to do next." Thomas nodded slowly. 43,000. It was a fraction of what they had lost, but it was something. It was hope. "The Concordat knows you're here," he said. "They threatened to destroy you if I didn't surrender myself." Morrison's face hardened. "Then we fight. We've been preparing for this possibility since we arrived. The ship is armed and our people are ready." "No," Thomas shook his head. "You can't fight them. Not directly. They'll bring everything they have, and 40,000 people can't stand against the combined might of the Concordat. But there is another way." He told Morrison about his years of guerrilla warfare, about the fleets he had destroyed and the fear he had sown throughout the galaxy. He explained his methods, his philosophy, his complete dedication to making the aliens pay for what they had done. Morrison listened in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. "Thomas," the captain said when the tale was finished, "what you've become, this isn't what we fought for. This isn't what humanity stands for." "Humanity is dead," Thomas replied flatly. "What we stand for died with our worlds. All that's left now is justice. Is it justice, or is it just revenge?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. Then he smiled, and Morrison felt a chill run down his spine at the expression on the younger man's face. Does it matter? The meeting was held in the Aspiration's main conference room, with Thomas facing an assembly of the colony ship's senior officers and civilian leaders. He could see the mix of emotions on their faces: hope, fear, admiration, and something that might have been horror. These people had heard the stories, the whispered rumors that had spread even to their hidden sanctuary. They knew what he had become in the years since the genocide. Thomas stood before them and began to speak. 3 years ago, the galactic Concordat murdered our species. They burned our worlds, slaughtered our children, and hunted us across the stars like animals. They did this because they feared us, feared what we might become, what we might accomplish, and they were right to be afraid. He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was absolutely silent. "I have spent the last 3 years showing them the consequences of their actions. I have destroyed their fleets, crippled their economies, and taught them that humanity cannot be so easily erased. But it's not enough. It will never be enough, because for every human life they took, the galaxy owes us a blood debt that can never be fully paid." A woman near the back of the room stood up. Thomas recognized her as Dr. Mary Scott, one of the Aspiration's chief scientists. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tremor in her hands. "What are you proposing, Thomas? That we continue this war forever? That we sacrifice ourselves on the altar of vengeance?" "I'm proposing that we win," Thomas replied. "Not just survive, but triumph. The aliens think they can hide from the consequences of genocide by claiming it was necessary for galactic peace. I intend to show them otherwise." Another voice spoke up. Commander David Park, the ship's tactical officer. "The Concordat has thousands of worlds, millions of ships. Even if we could somehow match their numbers, we'd still be outnumbered 1,000,000 to 1. It's impossible." Thomas smiled. "You're thinking like a human from the old days, David. You're thinking about fair fights and honorable warfare. But the Concordat gave up any claim to honor when they decided to exterminate us. They've taught me a valuable lesson about the nature of power in this galaxy." He walked to the room's main display and activated a holographic star chart. The swirling lights showed the territories of a dozen major powers, their borders shifting and overlapping in complex patterns. "The Concordat isn't a unified government," Thomas continued. "It's an alliance of convenience, held together by mutual fear and economic necessity. Each member species has its own agenda, its own weaknesses, its own enemies. They united against us because we threatened their established order, but that same order is their weakness." Dr. Scott frowned. "I don't understand." "The galaxy has been at peace for over 2 centuries, Thomas explained. "Stable, predictable, boring. The various species have grown soft, complacent. Their militaries are designed for show rather than actual warfare. Their economies are built on the assumption that trade routes will remain secure and supply lines will never be disrupted. Their governments assume that the rules will continue to be followed. He gestured to the star chart, and red markers began to appear throughout the displayed territory. But what happens when someone stops following the rules? What happens when the trade routes become hunting grounds? When supply convoys start disappearing? When the safe, civilized galaxy they've built begins to collapse around them? The room was silent as the implications sank in. Commander Park was the first to speak. You're talking about systematic economic warfare, disrupting their entire infrastructure. More than that, Thomas said. I'm talking about psychological warfare on a galactic scale. For 3 years, I've been testing their responses, learning their weaknesses, mapping their fears. The Concordat races aren't warriors. They're bureaucrats and merchants who hired others to do their fighting for them, strip away their hired muscle, threaten their profit margins, and they'll turn on each other like wolves. Dr. Scott shook her head. Even if that worked, it would take decades, centuries. We'd be condemning ourselves to a life of endless conflict. Would we? Thomas asked. Or would we be ensuring that humanity has a future, that our children have a place in this galaxy? He deactivated the star chart and turned back to face the assembled leaders. His expression was calm, almost peaceful, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made several of them step back. The Concordat made a choice when they decided to exterminate us, he said quietly. They chose fear over coexistence, genocide over diplomacy. They opened a door that can never be closed again. The only question now is whether we walk through it with purpose or whether we cower in the shadows until they find us and finish what they started. Captain Morrison stood up slowly. And if we refuse, if we decide that revenge isn't worth becoming monsters. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. Then you die anyway, all of you, because the Concordat will never stop hunting us, never stop fearing us. We are the living reminder of their greatest sin, and they will not rest until that reminder is erased forever. The silence that followed was profound. Thomas could see the struggle in their faces, the war between their moral convictions and the cold logic of survival. He understood their hesitation. He had felt it himself in the early days after the genocide. But that hesitation had died with his homeworld, burned away in the fire of absolute loss. Finally, a young man near the front of the room spoke up. Thomas didn't recognize him, but from his uniform markings, he appeared to be a junior officer. What would you have us do? Thomas smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in the expression. First, we survive. The Concordat knows you're here, which means this sanctuary is compromised. We need to move the aspiration to a new location, somewhere they can't find you. Then we begin the real work, which is we turn their own tactics against them. The Concordat succeeded in their genocide because they struck without warning, targeted civilians, and showed no mercy. They broke every law of warfare, every moral principle they claimed to uphold. So we respond in kind. Thomas walked to the viewport and stared out at the swirling nebula beyond. But we don't just copy their methods, we perfect them. We become everything they feared we might become, and then we become worse. We make them remember why they were afraid of us in the first place. He turned back to the assembly, and his smile widened. We make them beg for mercy. The evacuation of the aspiration took 6 days. Thomas had insisted on personally overseeing every aspect of the operation, from the selection of the new hiding place to the routing of the supply convoys that would keep the colony ship functional. He had learned patience in his years of solitary warfare, but he had also learned the value of thorough preparation. The new sanctuary was deep in the void reaches, a region of space so empty and lifeless that even the most desperate pirates avoided it. There, hidden among the gravitational anomalies of a dead star system, the aspiration could remain concealed for years. Thomas had stocked the area with supply caches and automated defense platforms, turning the entire system into a fortress that could withstand anything short of a full Concordat battle fleet. But even as he worked to protect the survivors, Thomas was planning his next move. The revelation that 40,000 humans still lived had changed everything. He was no longer just a lone avenger seeking personal satisfaction. He was the guardian of his species' future. That future required more than mere survival. It required victory. On the seventh day, as the aspiration settled into its new hiding place, Thomas met privately with Captain Morrison in the colony ship's botanical gardens. The artificial ecosystem was a small miracle of human engineering, a living reminder of the worlds they had lost. Trees from Earth grew alongside flowering vines from Nova Pacifica, while streams of recycled water carried the sounds of home through the carefully maintained landscape. Morrison was tending to a patch of roses when Thomas found him. The older man looked up as he approached, soil still clinging to his hands. "I used to have a garden like this back on Kepler Station," Morrison said quietly. "My wife loved roses. She said they reminded her of her grandmother's farm on Earth." "What happened to her?" Thomas asked. "The same thing that happened to everyone else." Morrison's voice was steady, but Thomas could see the pain in his eyes. "The Nalar hit Kepler Station on the second day of the purge. Military target, they said. Strategic necessity." Thomas nodded. He had read the reports, seen the casualty figures. Kepler Station had housed over 2 million civilians when the Nalar fleet arrived. None had survived. "I dream about her sometimes," Morrison continued. "We're back in the garden, and she's showing me how to prune the roses properly. She always said I was too rough with them, that they needed a gentle touch. In the dreams, I finally understand what she meant." He stood up and brushed the soil from his hands. "Then I wake up, and I remember where I am, what we've lost, what we've become." Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching a butterfly, one of the few Earth species they had managed to save, dance among the flowers. "Do you regret it, surviving?" "Sometimes," Morrison admitted. "It would have been easier to die with them, cleaner. But then I look at the children we saved, and I remember why we're still here. Someone has to carry the story forward. Someone has to remember." "Is that enough for you? Just remembering?" Morrison looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that memory without action is just another form of death," Thomas said. "The Concordat is counting on us to fade away, to become just another footnote in galactic history. They want us to spend our remaining years mourning the past instead of building a future." "And what kind of future are you planning to build, Thomas? One built on the bodies of our enemies?" Thomas turned away from the roses and looked out through the garden's transparent dome at the starfield beyond. "I'm planning to build the future humanity deserves. One where we never have to hide again. One where the word human inspires respect instead of genocide. Through fear, through strength, through the demonstration that actions have consequences, even on a galactic scale." Thomas faced Morrison again. "The Concordat made their choice 3 years ago. Now they have to live with the results." Morrison sighed. "You're talking about a war that could last centuries. Generations of our children growing up knowing nothing but conflict and hatred. Better that than growing up as slaves, or not growing up at all," Thomas replied. "The Concordat has shown us what happens to species that don't fight back. They become extinct. So we become like them? Killers and conquerors. We become survivors. We become whatever we need to become to ensure that humanity has a tomorrow. Morrison was quiet for a long time, staring at the roses in his garden. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. My wife used to say that the most dangerous thing about roses wasn't the thorns, it was how beautiful they were. She said beauty could make you forget to be careful, make you reach out without thinking. And then you'd get cut. Thomas nodded slowly. The galaxy forgot to be careful with us. They saw our art, our music, our philosophy, and they thought we were harmless. They forgot that humans are predators too. And now, you're going to remind them? Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. I'm going to do more than that, James. I'm going to teach them a lesson they'll never forget. The first phase of Thomas's plan began 3 weeks later with the seemingly random disappearance of a Concordat diplomatic convoy in the Rho sector. The convoy was carrying trade negotiators from a dozen different species, along with their security details and enough electronic intelligence to map half the Concordat's communication networks. The ships simply vanished without a trace, leaving only a brief transmission that was broadcast on every major frequency in the sector. The Concordat owes humanity a debt. Payment is now due. Within hours, every major power in the galaxy was scrambling to locate the missing convoy. Search fleets combed the area where the ships had disappeared, but found nothing. No wreckage, no escape pods, no clues to what had happened. It was as if the convoy had simply been erased from existence. The truth was both simpler and more disturbing. Thomas had spent months developing a new technology based on human gravitational research. A field the Concordat races had always considered theoretical curiosity rather than practical science. The gravitational disruptor was barely the size of a shuttlecraft, but it could create localized space-time distortions that effectively translated matter from one location to another instantaneously. The diplomatic convoy hadn't been destroyed, it had been moved. The ships now sat in a hidden facility deep in asteroid field, their crews imprisoned but unharmed. Thomas had no intention of killing the diplomats, at least not yet. They were more valuable as hostages and intelligence sources. The second phase began 2 days later, when a hegemony ore transport carrying rare metals to the Nala homeworld exploded in the middle of a heavily trafficked space lane. The detonation was precisely calculated to cause maximum disruption with minimum casualties. The transport's crew had been evacuated minutes before the explosion, though they didn't know why their ship's emergency systems had activated. The explosion left behind a debris field that effectively blocked the space lane for weeks, forcing thousands of ships to take lengthy detours. But more importantly, it left behind a message burned into the hulls of nearby vessels in letters 3 meters high. Remember Avalon. Remember Earth. Remember what you did to us. The third phase was more subtle. Thomas had learned that fear was more effective than violence in achieving his goals. Rather than attacking more ships directly, he began a campaign of psychological warfare designed to paralyze Concordat commerce through uncertainty and paranoia. Ships began receiving anonymous messages warning them to avoid certain routes at certain times. Most ignored the warnings until those ships started disappearing exactly as predicted. Trade schedules became meaningless as captains refused to follow established routes. Insurance rates skyrocketed as Lloyds of Centauri tried to calculate the risk of human interference. Within a month, Thomas had accomplished something no conventional military force could have achieved. He had brought Concordat commerce to a virtual standstill without firing a shot. But he was just getting started. Admiral Kethvar stood before the emergency session of the Concordat Security Council, his 4 eyes fixed on the holographic displays surrounding the chamber. Each display showed a different aspect of the crisis that was consuming the galaxy. Shipping routes dark with abandoned commerce, military fleets spread thin, trying to protect an impossibly large area, and always the question that no one wanted to voice: where was the human? The situation has become untenable, Kethvar reported to the assembled delegates. In the past month, we have lost over 40 vessels to what can only be described as impossible attacks. Ships disappear from the middle of heavily defended convoys. Cargo transports explode without warning. Trade routes that have been secure for centuries are now considered too dangerous to use. Chancellor Vexhai of the Carithian Assembly raised one of her many arms. Have we been able to establish any pattern to these attacks? Any way to predict where the human will strike next? None, Kethvar admitted reluctantly. The attacks appear random, but they're achieving a very specific goal. Concordat commerce has decreased by 70% in the past month. Several member worlds are reporting supply shortages. If this continues, we'll be facing economic collapse within a year. Minister Zolthar of the hegemony of Nalar clicked his mandibles in agitation. One human, one ship. How is it possible that a single individual is bringing our entire civilization to its knees? Because he's not fighting like a human, Kethvar replied. He's fighting like something else entirely. Something that understands our weaknesses better than we do. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. For over 2 centuries, the Concordat had maintained peace through a careful balance of economic interdependence and military deterrence. No single species could risk disrupting that balance without facing retaliation from all the others. But Thomas wasn't playing by their rules. He wasn't trying to conquer territory or impose political demands. He was simply destroying the foundations of their civilization, one ship at a time. "What about the colony ship?" asked Ambassador Rethko of the Centauri Trade Federation. "Have we been able to locate the human survivors?" Kethavar's expression darkened. Numberar scouts found the nebula where they were hiding, but the ship was gone. They vanished as completely as their protector. "Then we have no leverage over him?" "None. And even if we did, I'm not certain it would matter. Our intelligence suggests that the human has moved beyond simple revenge. He's now acting with a strategic purpose that goes far beyond the protection of his species' survivors." Chancellor Vexhai leaned forward in her seat. What kind of strategic purpose? The systematic destruction of Concordat civilization. The words hung in the air like a curse. No one spoke for several minutes, each delegate lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Minister Zolthar broke the silence. "Recommendations?" Kethvar activated another holographic display, this one showing the disposition of Concordat military forces throughout the galaxy. Red zones marked areas where human attacks had occurred, while blue zones showed the location of their own fleets. "We have 3 options," he said. "First, we can continue our current strategy of reactive defense. We spread our forces thin, trying to protect every possible target and hope that we get lucky." "That's not working," Ambassador Rethko pointed out. "No, it's not. Second option, we concentrate our forces in a few key systems and abandon the rest to their fate. We protect what we can and write off the losses as acceptable casualties." "That would mean abandoning millions of our people to this madman," Chancellor Vexhai protested. "Yes, which brings us to the third option." Kethvar paused, clearly reluctant to continue. "We find a way to negotiate with him." The chamber erupted in angry voices. Several delegates rose to their feet, their various species expressions of outrage filling the air with a cacophony of clicks, chirps, and roars. Minister Zolthar's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Negotiate? With the terrorist who has been systematically attacking our people?" "He's not a terrorist," Kethvar replied quietly. "Terrorists have political goals. They want something that can be negotiated. This human wants something much simpler and much more dangerous." which is justice, or what he considers justice. And in his mind, justice requires the complete destruction of everyone who participated in the human genocide. The chamber fell silent again. Chancellor Vex High was the first to find her voice. All of us. All of us, Caithvar confirmed. Every species in the Concordat, every government that voted for the purge, every military officer who participated in the attacks, every civilian who benefited from the redistribution of human territory. In his eyes, we are all complicit. Ambassador Rethko shook her head slowly. Then there's no point in negotiation. He won't stop until we're all dead. Perhaps, or perhaps there's another way. Caithvar manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on a particular region of space. Our intelligence suggests that the human isn't acting alone anymore. He's had contact with the survivors from the colony ship. If we can convince them that their protector has become a monster, that his actions are destroying any chance of peaceful coexistence, you want to turn the surviving humans against their own protector. Minister Zolthar's tone was incredulous. I want to survive this, Caithvar replied bluntly. And right now, that's our only hope. Captain Morrison read the message for the third time, but the words didn't change. The transmission had come through one of the Aspiration's most secure communication channels, encrypted with codes that only a handful of people should have known. Yet here it was, an offer of negotiation from Admiral Caithvar himself. The message was simple and direct. The Concordat wanted to discuss terms for ending Thomas's campaign of terror. They were offering safe passage to a neutral meeting site, guarantees of non-interference with the colony ship, even reparations for the human genocide. All they asked in return was that the survivors use their influence to convince Thomas to stop his attacks. Morrison set down the communication pad and stared out of his quarters viewport at the dead stars of their new hiding place. 3 months had passed since Thomas had moved them to this sanctuary, 3 months during which they had received regular reports of his activities throughout Concordat space. Ships disappearing, trade routes disrupted, entire sectors paralyzed by fear of the lone human warrior. Part of Morrison was proud of what Thomas had accomplished. The young man had become a symbol of human resilience, proof that their species would not go quietly into extinction. But another part of him was deeply troubled by the methods Thomas was using and the person he was becoming in the process. A soft chime indicated someone at his door. Morrison called for them to enter and was surprised to see Dr. Scott. The scientist looked haggard, as if she hadn't slept in days. Mary? What's wrong? I've been monitoring the galactic communication networks, she said without preamble. The reports we've been receiving about Thomas's activities, they're not telling us everything. Morrison frowned. What do you mean? Scott activated a portable holographic projector, filling Morrison's quarters with a 3-dimensional star chart. Red markers indicated the locations of Thomas's confirmed attacks, while yellow markers showed areas where suspicious activity had been reported. Look at this pattern, Scott said, manipulating the display. Thomas isn't just attacking randomly. He's following a very specific strategy, targeting systems in a precise sequence. What kind of sequence? He's working his way inward, from the rim toward the core worlds of each Concordat species. But he's not just disrupting commerce. He's mapping their defensive capabilities, testing their response times, learning their weaknesses. Morrison studied the display more carefully. You think he's planning something larger? I think he's planning the systematic conquest of Concordat space. Not destruction, conquest. He's positioning himself to become the sole military power in this region of the galaxy. The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. My God, if you're right. If I'm right, then Thomas isn't trying to save humanity. He's trying to replace the Concordat with something worse. a human empire built on fear and enforced through terror. Morrison was quiet for a long time, processing what Scott had shown him. Finally, he looked up at the scientist. "How certain are you of this analysis?" 80%, maybe higher. Scott deactivated the display. "James, we have to stop him, before he goes too far to be brought back." "And how exactly do you propose we do that?" "Thomas has become the most dangerous individual in the galaxy. He's not going to listen to moral arguments about the path he's chosen." Scott handed him the communication pad containing Kethvar's message. "We accept their offer. We meet with the Concordat and work together to find a solution that doesn't involve the systematic destruction of galactic civilization. You want to betray him, after everything he's done to protect us?" "I want to save him," Scott replied. "And I want to save the galaxy from him. Thomas has become something that humanity was never meant to be. If we don't stop him now, history will remember us as the species that brought darkness to the stars." Morrison stared at the message for a long time. Then, slowly, he began to compose a reply. The meeting took place on Zerion Station, a neutral trading post in the border region between Concordat and independent space. Morrison had brought a small delegation from the Aspiration, Scott, Commander Park, and 2 other senior officers. The Concordat had sent a much larger group, including Admiral Kethvar and representatives from every major member species. The station's conference facility was luxurious by the standards of most species, but Morrison found himself uncomfortable in the alien furnishings. Everything was sized for beings much larger than humans, and the atmospheric mixture was slightly off from what he was used to. But these were minor discomforts compared to the weight of what they were discussing. "Thank you for coming," Admiral Kethvar said as the meeting began. "I know that this cannot have been an easy decision." Morrison nodded curtly. "We're here because we believe that there has to be a better way than endless warfare. But I want to make something clear from the beginning. We are not here to surrender or to betray Thomas Harry. We're here to find a solution that serves everyone's interests." "Understood. Perhaps you could begin by telling us about the human's current state of mind. Our analysts believe that he may have moved beyond rational thought." Dr. Scott leaned forward. "Thomas isn't insane, if that's what you're asking, but he has become something that I'm not sure we can call human anymore. The genocide changed him in ways that go beyond simple trauma. He's become a living embodiment of vengeance." "Can he be reasoned with?" "I don't know," Scott admitted. 3 years ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Thomas was one of our most level-headed officers, someone who believed deeply in diplomacy and peaceful solutions. But that person died with our worlds. Commander Park spoke up for the first time. "What exactly are you proposing? That we somehow convince Thomas to stop his campaign and return to hiding?" Admiral Kethvar exchanged glances with his fellow delegates before responding. "Actually, we were hoping for something more comprehensive. A complete cessation of hostilities, combined with a formal peace treaty between humanity and the Concordat." Morrison felt a bitter laugh escape his throat. "A peace treaty? Admiral, your people committed genocide against our species. You hunted us across the galaxy and tried to exterminate every last one of us. What possible basis could there be for peace?" "Mutual survival," Kethvar replied simply. "Your protector is destroying both of our civilizations. If he continues his current course, there will be nothing left to make peace over." The room fell silent. Morrison could see the truth in the alien admiral's words, even as part of him recoiled from the implications. Thomas's campaign was indeed escalating beyond anything that could be called proportional response. "What would be the terms of such a treaty?" Dr. Scott asked. Minister Zolthar of the Nala leaned forward. "Full recognition of human sovereignty over any territory they choose to claim. Reparations for the losses suffered during the conflict. Guaranteed protection under Concordat law for all human survivors. And, in exchange, Thomas Harry ceases his attacks and submits to joint human Concordat authority for trial on charges of terrorism and mass murder. The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison felt his hands clench into fists as he struggled to control his anger. You want us to hand over the one person who has fought to protect our species, the man who has single-handedly prevented our complete extinction. We want to prevent a galactic war that could destroy billions of innocent lives, Kethvar replied. Captain Morrison, I understand your loyalty to Thomas Harry, but surely you can see that his current path leads only to mutual annihilation. Commander Park stood up abruptly. This meeting is over. We're not going to betray the man who saved us so that you can sleep better at night. Please, Chancellor Vexhai of the Corethian Assembly spoke for the first time, her multiple arms spread in a gesture of supplication. Hear us out. We're not asking you to betray anyone. We're asking you to save him from himself. What do you mean? Morrison asked, though he remained standing. Your reports indicate that Thomas has been operating alone for months, with minimal contact even with your people. Our psychologists believe that this isolation, combined with the trauma of genocide, has created a dangerous psychological condition. He's no longer fighting to protect humanity, he's fighting to punish the galaxy. Dr. Scott frowned. You've been studying him? We've been trying to understand him, Kethvar admitted, because understanding him is the only way we can hope to stop him, and what we've learned is deeply disturbing. The Admiral activated a holographic display showing Thomas's attack patterns over the past several months. The red markers formed a clear spiral pattern, moving inexorably inward toward the core worlds of Concordat space. This isn't random terrorism, Kethvar continued. This is a systematic campaign designed to paralyze our defenses and leave us vulnerable to final assault. Our analysts believe that Thomas is planning to destroy the homeworlds of every species that participated in the human genocide. Morrison stared at the display, feeling a cold dread settle in his stomach. How many people live on those worlds? Approximately 40 billion. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Scott was the first to find her voice. 40 billion innocent civilians. From Thomas's perspective, there are no innocent civilians, Kethvar said quietly. Everyone who benefited from the redistribution of human territory, everyone who remained silent while the genocide occurred, everyone who continues to support the governments that ordered the purge, they're all complicit. Morrison sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were discussing. You're saying that he's planning to commit genocide himself. We're saying that he's already started. The economic disruption he's caused has resulted in supply shortages throughout Concordat space, medical shipments, food convoys, emergency relief supplies, all disrupted by his campaign. Our preliminary estimates suggest that his actions have already caused the deaths of over 2 million beings. Commander Park shook his head. That's not Thomas. He would never target civilians deliberately. Perhaps not deliberately, Chancellor Vexhai replied, but does intent matter to the families of the dead? Does it matter to the children who won't receive the medical treatment they need because Thomas destroyed their supply convoy? The weight of moral complexity settled over the human delegation like a suffocating blanket. Morrison could see the struggle in his companions' faces, the same struggle he felt in his own heart. How do you weigh the life of one man against the lives of billions? How do you balance justice against mercy, survival against morality? There has to be another way, Doctor, Scott said finally. Some solution that doesn't require us to choose between betraying Thomas and enabling mass murder. Admiral Kethvar nodded slowly. There is, but it would require unprecedented cooperation between our species and a level of trust that neither of us has any reason to offer. What kind of cooperation? Joint custody, Thomas submits to a tribunal composed of both human and Concordat representatives. If found guilty, he serves his sentence on a prison world administered jointly by both governments. If found innocent, he's released to live peacefully among his own people. Morrison considered the proposal carefully, and if he refuses to submit voluntarily, then we work together to capture him. Concordat resources combined with human knowledge of his psychology and tactics. It would be difficult, but possible. You're asking us to help you hunt down our own protector. We're asking you to help us save the galaxy from a war that no one can win, Kethva replied. Captain Morrison, I know this is difficult, but consider the alternative. If Thomas continues his current course, we'll be forced to mobilize the full military might of the Concordat against him. The collateral damage alone would dwarf anything that has happened so far. Dr. Scott looked up from her hands. How long do we have to decide? Our intelligence suggests that Thomas is preparing for a major operation against the Nalar homeworld. If he succeeds in destroying Nalar Prime, it will trigger a cascade reaction that could destabilize the entire region. We estimate that we have perhaps 2 weeks before he makes his move. The meeting continued for several more hours, but Morrison found himself unable to focus on the details. His mind kept returning to the image of Thomas as he had last seen him, standing in the botanical gardens of the Aspiration, speaking with quiet passion about the future of humanity. Had that future always included the deaths of billions? Or had Thomas's isolation and pain twisted his original vision into something monstrous? When the session finally ended, Morrison found himself walking alone through Xerion Station's commercial district. The sight of dozens of alien species mingling peacefully reminded him of what they stood to lose if Thomas's campaign continued. These beings had families, hopes, dreams, just as humans once had. Did they deserve to die for the crimes of their governments? But then he remembered the images from Earth's final transmission, the footage of Nala warships reducing humanity's birth world to glowing slag. He remembered the children who had died on Avalon, the families torn apart on 100 human worlds. Did those victims deserve any less justice than the aliens now threatened by Thomas's vengeance? Morrison was still wrestling with these questions when he returned to the human delegation's quarters. He found his companions engaged in heated debate over the Concordat's proposal. It's a trap, Commander Park was saying. They want us to deliver Thomas to them so they can execute him publicly and end the threat to their precious civilization. Maybe, Dr. Scott replied, but what if it's not? What if this is genuinely our only chance to prevent a galactic war? Since when do we negotiate with genocidaires? Park shot back. These are the same beings who voted to exterminate our entire species 3 years ago. Now they want us to trust them with the life of the one man who fought back. The one man who might become a mass murderer himself if we don't intervene, Scott countered. David, I understand your loyalty to Thomas. We all feel it. But we can't let that loyalty blind us to what he's becoming. Morrison cleared his throat, and both officers turned to face him. What did our people say when I told them about the meeting? Mixed reactions, Scott admitted. Some support the idea of negotiation. Others think we should warn Thomas immediately and help him prepare for whatever the Concordat is planning. And the children. What do they think? Park's expression softened. They don't understand why their protector has to be anyone's enemy. They just want to go home. Morrison nodded slowly. The children, 40,000 young humans, who had never known anything but exile and fear. What kind of future were they building for those children? One where they grew up hating every non-human species in the galaxy. One where the word human became synonymous with terrorism and genocide. Mary, he said finally, show me those attack patterns again. Scott activated her portable projector, and once again the star chart filled the room with its ominous display. Morrison studied it carefully, tracing the spiral path of Thomas's campaign with his finger. "If you're right about his ultimate objective," Morrison said slowly, "then he's not just planning to destroy the Concordat homeworlds. He's planning to become the sole power in this region of space. That's my assessment, yes. Which means that even if we wanted to stop him, we might not be able to. A man who can single-handedly paralyze galactic commerce isn't going to be deterred by moral arguments from his own people." Commander Park frowned. "What are you saying, Captain?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the holographic display. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "I'm saying that maybe the Concordat is right. Maybe the only way to save humanity's soul is to stop Thomas Harry." The decision to contact Thomas directly came after 3 days of agonizing debate among the human delegation. In the end, it was Dr. Scott who convinced Morrison that they owed their protector at least the opportunity to explain himself before they made any irreversible choices. The communication was sent through one of the aspiration's most secure channels, encrypted with codes that only Thomas would recognize. The message was simple. They needed to meet urgently to discuss the future of their species. Thomas's response came within hours, along with coordinates for a rendezvous point in the Sigma Draconis system. Morrison felt a mixture of relief and dread as he read the brief message. Relief that Thomas was still willing to communicate with them, dread at what that communication might reveal. The journey to Sigma Draconis took 2 days in one of the aspiration's fastest shuttles. Morrison made the trip alone, despite the protests of his security chief. He felt that this conversation needed to happen between friends without the complications of formal delegations or military escorts. The rendezvous point was a small asteroid mining station that had been abandoned for decades. Thomas's ship was already there when Morrison arrived, its scarred hull gleaming dully in the light of the system's distant star. The sight of it sent a chill down Morrison's spine. The vessel looked less like a ship than like a weapon, bristling with modifications and upgrades that spoke to years of constant warfare. Thomas was waiting for him in the station's old command center, standing before a bank of dead monitors with his back to the airlock. He hadn't changed much in the months since Morrison had last seen him, still the same lean build, the same intense eyes, but there was something different about him now, a quality of absolute stillness that reminded Morrison of a predator at rest. "Hello, James," Thomas said without turning around. "You look tired." "I am tired," Morrison admitted. "Tired of hiding, tired of running, tired of watching our people live in fear. And tired of me, I imagine." Thomas finally turned to face him, and Morrison was struck by the absence of emotion in his expression. The great human protector who has become an embarrassment to his own species. "Is that what you think this is about? Embarrassment?" Thomas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think this is about the meeting you had on Zerion Station 3 days ago. The one where the Concordat asked you to help them capture me in exchange for a handful of promises they have no intention of keeping." Morrison felt his heart skip a beat. "How did you—" "I have eyes everywhere now, James. The Concordat's communication networks, their intelligence services, their military command structure. I've been inside all of it for months. Did you really think I wouldn't know about your little diplomatic adventure?" The casual revelation of Thomas's surveillance capabilities sent another chill through Morrison. "If you knew about the meeting, then you know what the Concordat is offering. Peace, recognition, reparations." "I know what they're offering," Thomas replied. "The question is, do you know what they're really planning?" He gestured to the bank of monitors, and several of them flickered to life. Morrison found himself looking at intelligence reports, military deployment orders, and strategic assessments, all bearing Concordat security stamps. "While you were negotiating with Admiral Kethvar Thomas continued. The Concordat was mobilizing the largest military force in galactic history. Over 10,000 ships, drawn from every member species. Their stated objective is to locate and destroy the human terrorist threatening galactic security. Morrison stared at the displays in shock. But they promised that if we cooperated. They lied, James. Just like they lied when they promised to respect human sovereignty. Just like they lied when they said the purge was a temporary security measure. The Concordat has never negotiated in good faith with humanity, and they never will. The evidence was overwhelming, but Morrison found himself grasping for alternatives. Maybe this is just a contingency plan. Maybe they're preparing for the possibility that negotiations fail. Thomas laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. Look at Monitor 4. Morrison turned to see what appeared to be a tactical assessment of the Aspiration's new hiding place. The report was detailed and accurate, including the location of the supply caches and defensive platforms that Thomas had so carefully positioned. "They've found us," Morrison whispered. "They've always known where you were. The only reason they haven't attacked is because they were hoping to use you as bait to draw me out." Thomas's expression hardened. "Which, I suppose, they have." The full scope of the Concordat's deception hit Morrison like a physical blow. The negotiations, the offers of peace, the appeals to humanity's better nature, all of it had been an elaborate trap designed to lure Thomas into the open. "My God," Morrison breathed. "What have we done?" "You've done what you thought was right," Thomas replied. "You've tried to find a peaceful solution to an impossible situation. I don't blame you for that, James. I blame myself for not seeing this coming sooner." Morrison looked up at his old friend, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in months. "What are you going to do?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out through the command center's viewport at his battle-scarred ship. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost contemplative. "I'm going to do what I should have done from the beginning. I'm going to end this war. By destroying the Concordat homeworlds. By giving the galaxy something to fear more than the possibility of human survival." Thomas turned back to Morrison, and his eyes burned with a cold fire. The Concordat made their choice when they decided that genocide was an acceptable solution to the human problem. Now, they're going to live with the consequences. Morrison felt a desperate need to reach his friend, to somehow bridge the gap that had opened between them. "Thomas, listen to yourself. You're talking about killing billions of innocent people. I'm talking about justice, long overdue justice for the 7 billion humans who died screaming in the fires of Concordat security measures. This isn't justice, it's revenge." "What's the difference?" Thomas asked quietly. "When an entire species is murdered, when their children are burned alive in their schools, when their homeworlds are reduced to radioactive slag, what's the difference between justice and revenge?" Morrison had no answer for that. The moral complexity of their situation had moved beyond simple categories of right and wrong into a grey area where survival and vengeance became indistinguishable. "There has to be another way," Morrison said finally. "There was," Thomas replied. "It was called coexistence. The Concordat rejected it in favor of extinction. Now they get to discover what extinction actually looks like." Thomas walked to the command center's communication console and began entering a complex series of codes. Morrison watched with growing alarm as multiple displays showed connection protocols initializing throughout Concordat space. "What are you doing?" Sending a message. To every government, every military command, every civilian authority in Concordat territory. Thomas's fingers moved across the console with practiced efficiency. "I want them to understand exactly what's about to happen to them." The main display filled with an image of Thomas himself, recorded in real time as he spoke into the communication array. Morrison could see the broadcast being transmitted simultaneously to thousands of destinations across the galaxy. "Citizens of the galactic Concordat," Thomas began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. 3 years ago, your governments decided that humanity posed a threat to galactic security. They were right. Today, you will discover just how right they were. Morrison watched in horrified fascination as Thomas outlined his ultimatum to the galaxy. Complete surrender within 72 hours, or face systematic destruction starting with the homeworlds of the species that had voted for human genocide. No negotiations, no compromise, no mercy. You have 72 hours to decide, Thomas concluded. Choose wisely. It will be your last choice. The transmission ended, leaving Morrison and Thomas alone in the silence of the abandoned station. Morrison could barely comprehend what he had just witnessed. A single human being declaring war on the entire galaxy. "Thomas," Morrison said quietly, "you've just signed our death warrant. Every species in the galaxy will unite against us now. They'll hunt down every human survivor and—" "No," Thomas interrupted. "They won't. Because they'll be too busy trying to survive what comes next." He activated another series of displays showing the positions of what appeared to be hundreds of automated platforms scattered throughout Concordat space. Morrison realized with growing horror that Thomas had been preparing for this moment for months, seeding the galaxy with weapons that could be triggered remotely. "My God, what have you built?" Thomas smiled, and for the first time in their conversation, there was genuine warmth in the expression. "Insurance, James. Insurance that humanity will never again face extinction at the hands of those who fear us." Morrison stared at his old friend, seeing in him the ghost of the man he had once known and the shadow of something far more dangerous. "This isn't what we fought for, Thomas. This isn't what humanity stands for. Humanity stands for whatever it needs to stand for to survive," Thomas replied. "And right now, it needs to stand for the principle that genocide has consequences." The communication console chimed, indicating incoming transmissions from across the galaxy. Morrison could see the panic spreading through Concordat space as governments realized the scope of the threat they faced. Emergency sessions, military mobilizations, evacuation orders, the entire galaxy was convulsing in fear. 72 hours, Thomas repeated quietly. "Let's see if they choose wisdom over pride." Morrison looked at his friend one last time, then turned toward the airlock. "I have to get back to the aspiration. Our people need to know what's coming." "James," Thomas's voice stopped him at the threshold. "Tell them that whatever happens in the next 72 hours, they're safe. The platforms I've deployed won't target human settlements. Our people will survive this." "And after? What happens after you've destroyed half the galaxy?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the stars beyond the viewport. "After? After we rebuild. We create something better than what came before. Something that remembers the price of trying to erase humanity from existence." Morrison left without another word, his mind reeling from the magnitude of what Thomas had set in motion. As his shuttle cleared the asteroid station, he could see Thomas's ship beginning to move, heading deeper into Concordat space to oversee the final phase of his campaign. Behind him, scattered across 10,000 star systems, the automated platforms that Thomas had spent months deploying began their activation sequences. In 72 hours, they would either stand down in response to Concordat surrender, or they would begin the systematic destruction of galactic civilization. The last human had made his choice. Now, the galaxy would discover the price of genocide. Epilogue. The choice. 71 hours and 37 minutes after Thomas's ultimatum, Admiral Kethvar stood in the Concordat's emergency command center, watching the galaxy tear itself apart. Every major government was in session, debating options that ranged from total surrender to mutual annihilation. Military fleets were deploying to defensive positions around homeworlds, while civilian populations fled toward the outer rim in anything that could carry them. But it was already too late. Thomas's platforms were not merely weapons. They were a demonstration of technological superiority that rendered conventional defense meaningless. The devices had somehow been integrated into the fundamental infrastructure of Concordat space, making them impossible to detect or disable without triggering their detonation. A few test probes had confirmed the horrifying truth. Thomas possessed the ability to collapse the quantum foundations of entire star systems. "Sir," his aide reported, "we're receiving surrender offers from 17 member governments. They're willing to accept Thomas Harry's terms unconditionally." Kethvar nodded grimly. "And the others?" "Preparing for war. The Nalar hegemony has vowed to fight to the last ship rather than submit to human tyranny." "Fools," Kethvar muttered. "They still don't understand what we're facing." The main display showed the position of Thomas's ship, currently approaching the edge of Nalar space. Intelligence reports suggested that he was personally overseeing the final preparations for his campaign, ensuring that every detail of the galaxy's destruction would proceed according to his design. "Admiral," another officer called out, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Captain Morrison of the human colony ship." Kethvar turned toward the communication station. On screen, Morrison's haggard face appeared on the main display, his expression haunted by exhaustion and moral anguish. Behind him, Kethvar could see other humans, scientists, officers, civilians, all watching with the same mixture of hope and despair. "Admiral Kethvar," Morrison began, "I need you to understand something about Thomas Harry. He's not a monster. He's a man who has been broken by unimaginable loss and transformed by the need for justice. But somewhere inside that weapon you've created, the human being still exists." "What are you proposing, Captain?" "One last attempt at communication. Not surrender, not negotiation. Just a conversation between two soldiers who understand the cost of war." Kethvar considered the request. They had less than 23 minutes before Thomas's deadline expired. Every military analyst in the Concordat agreed that resistance was futile. The platforms could not be stopped. The technology could not be countered. Their only hope lay in the slim possibility that some fragment of Thomas's original humanity might be reached. "Very well," Kethvar said finally. "But if this fails, then we all discover what genocide actually looks like when it's carried out by someone who understands the meaning of the word." The transmission ended, leaving Kethvar alone with his thoughts and the weight of galactic history. In 22 minutes, either diplomacy would achieve what military might could not, or the Concordat would learn the final lesson of their war against humanity. Some species should never be pushed to the edge of extinction, because when they return from that edge, they bring the darkness with them. The galaxy had 72 hours to choose between surrender and annihilation. In the end, they chose something far more dangerous. They chose to test whether Thomas Harry was still human enough to be reasoned with. The answer would reshape the meaning of both mercy and justice across 10,000 star systems. But first, they would have to survive the conversation.